No, it's absolutely right. And remember, Odessa was a Greek city to a very large extent. And the trading was, Greek traders, of course, Armenian traders, Jewish traders. These networks of trade were extensive. And you're absolutely correct that everybody knows each other extremely well. The Turks and the Greeks, of course, they know each other. Everybody knows each other. And I was actually just had the pleasure of having a long discussion with the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, which goes back to, I don't remember whether it's the 1st century AD or the 2nd century AD.
First,
he's a Christian patriarch in Damascus, in an Aramean speaking community, for heaven's sake. This is 2,000 years. And of course, we were discussing exactly this wonderful mix of local cultures in Syria. And Barack Obama sends in the CIA in 2012 to overthrow Assad, lights the match, blows up the place, not knowing anything about Syria, about its history, about its culture, about its diversity, just lighting the match. And so I think it's a fascinating thing, and it's really worth contemplating. I can think of let's consider 3 great empires of this region. First, the Persian Empire, going back the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great, who, by the way, saved the Jewish people. He allowed the exiles from Babylonia to return to Jerusalem. And the idea of that Iran and and Israel are natural enemies is fatuous, given that the actual history of the two goes back to the 6th century BC, close relations. But what I was going to say about the Persians, they were very clever. They allowed local rule, local religions, and huge diversity. And so actually the Jewish Second Temple period in today's Israel, but back in the 4th and 3rd century was under the suzerainty of Persia, because it was a very tolerant system. Then came Alexander the Great's conquests between 331 and 323 BC. And of course, he reached India, created the Hellenistic empires. But his genius, even as this kid, although he had the greatest teacher in history, in my view, Aristotle, but Alexander knew, take local traditions, don't try to impose things, let things be. And so the Hellenistic kingdoms, of course, brought wonderful Greek culture, Greek language, Greek knowledge, Greek wisdom, but also with a lot of local tolerance and incredible diversity. And the Ottomans, I don't know, as a Greek, you may have a bit more jaundiced view of the Ottomans than I do. I rather like the Ottomans in a lot of ways, but they had, of course, multiple minority communities who lived peacefully. That is why His All Holiness, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, lives in Istanbul, Constantinople, and keeps his throne as the Patriarch of Greek Orthodoxy, or the All Ecumenical Patriarch, I should say, because the Ottomans kept all sorts of communities within the Ottoman Empire. And you can see these minority communities till today, local religion, local language, local cultures. It's quite wonderful. And that, I would say, is your point, that lots of wars, but actually the fact that the diversity has remained for 2 millennia plus means that this wasn't mass extinctions, genocides, attempts to impose one faith or one religion. And the Jewish community in today's modern Iran was not forced out by the Iranians. It was pulled out by the Zionist movement of Israel, which tried to bring everyone to Israel and depleted all of these ancient, long-standing, traditional Jewish communities. And I find that very, very sad, actually, because that diversity is an incredible cultural strength, but also an economic strength because of the trading systems.
And that brings me to the point about Israel, because of course Israel can become a part of this system. As I said, a system where everybody learns to live with everybody else. Tensions exist. And of course, the point is that in the modern world, the kind of tensions that used to exist in the Middle East, the wars, which are usually wars between local dynasties, they're not exactly the same as European wars. If you know your medieval history of this part of the world well. That period of war, anyway, is obsolete, but the trade is not. And I myself, and I was very, very impressed by that meeting in Riyadh. Actually,
I was too.
I mean, everybody came together. Erdogan was there, Assad was there, the Saudis were there, everybody was there, and they were all talking. The Iranians were there, and they were all talking together, and they were all talking together as a region, as a place where, and they were coming up with sophisticated political points. And I have to say, I felt that this does provide a real opening and a future, both for a political settlement of this crisis, which, in my opinion, is the ultimate crisis behind all the others in the Middle East, and also for the potential economic and social development of this region. If they can all come together and work together, and almost just about there doing it, then all of these synergies that do exist in the Middle East can finally start coming together, and then we could start to think of the Middle East in a completely different way.
It is absolutely the case. And the utter tragedy of what's happening right now, beyond the human disaster that Israel is causing, is that there is a clear path to peace. No question about it. The Israeli line, which I've heard for more than 50 years, there's no one to talk to on the other side, is such BS. There's no other way to put it, because the other side keeps saying, we want peace, we want normal relations, but you have to respect the fact that there are the Palestinian people who have political rights that need to be observed. It's really as simple as that. And when you look at this, and it is the terrible frustration. What's stopping that in Israel? What's stopping that is two different groups. One that happens to be in power right now, but there really is a group of zealots who believe, as a matter of theology, that all the land is promised to the Jews, and it's in the book of Joshua, and this is ours, no matter who happens to be there. And it's a completely unacceptable view, an extraordinarily dangerous one. It is not the majority view in Israel, but it is a powerful view. And the way Israeli politics works, which is to give added weight to small groups that tip the balance to majorities in multi-party coalitions, they have a loud voice. And some of these people, like Smotrich in the cabinet, who's the finance minister, are vulgar and destroying Israel because of their Well, a kind of genocidal intent, actually. So that's one group. The other group says, no, for security, we dare not risk making peace. And the stupid thing that they did, of course, but it was very premeditated, and it played games with the first group and won their support politically, was the settlements process after the 1967 war, when the secularists said, we don't trust Palestinians to have a state, so we're going to put Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory. And this was the famous expression back in 1970 was to put facts on the ground. And now there are more than 400,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and there are another 200 to 250,000 in East Jerusalem. And it's facts that have made peace so much harder to achieve. But the main point, from my point of view, is these settlements are illegal. They have been declared illegal repeatedly by the Security Council. And so I want the Security Council to vote a two-state solution along the 4th of June, 1967 borders, like it is declared for more than 50 years, and get on with peace. And Israel would find that it has plenty of neighbors to do business with, to have peaceful relations with, to have tourism with, and every other thing. But they need to stop the zealots who don't see this way, and they need to have some self-understanding that the other side has been talking about peace for decades. Israelis haven't wanted to hear it. And the United States has basically, unconditionally backed Israel until today. Let's be clear, whatever Blinken and others are saying about protecting civilians is a total sham, because it's American bombs dropping on Gaza every day right now. So this is not Americans protecting anything. They know perfectly well what they're doing. And that brings us back to the US side and also to Britain and the European imperial side. There is something about the evangelical religious view that has said we can control these things. And it's a little less tolerant. The fundamentalist evangelical Christian view in the United States, which is probably the most pro-Zionist part of American politics, at least alongside the Jewish community. But that view is, again, a kind of God-given, we have the right to rule view. And that is not what peaceful coexistence is about. Peaceful coexistence is about mutual respect, not the belief that one is the chosen one to rule in a particular place or to rule every place.
I wanted to shift a bit out of the Middle East. Is this okay? But still, it's an economic question, I guess, because a big thing happening now this week, of course, was the Chinese meeting with the EU. I think this was the first time they really met since the pandemic, and it kind of had the same issues where we. Because you spoke previously about the mindset in the United States, but it's a similar challenge now in Europe, I feel, because globalization is turning out very differently than many of the EU leaders suggested. It was supposed to be one which was Western-centric. And of course, now the key challenge or a concern, I guess, from Brussels would be that the Europeans are becoming very dependent on China, but China not so much dependent on Europe. So this asymmetry is something that's spooking, I think, the Europeans. So the key language you now hear from the EU would be de-risking, decoupling. But again, this is a dilemma for the Europeans, because if the Europeans would sever themselves from China, sever themselves from Chinese technologies and resources, like they cut themselves off Russian resources, it would make the European less economic competitive, less prosperous, and also their dependence then would increase on the United States, which would effectively make them more politically obedient. So this is not a good option. But on the other side, if they accept more economic connectivity with China, the concern is that the dependence would grow. So they have been looking for ways out. Well, one of them would be, hey, how about we put some sanctions on China where it fits us? But then, of course, the Europeans are very offended when the Chinese retaliate, because this is supposed to be a one-way tool. So they try to frame it in human rights because this is a good way of legitimizing one-sided sanctions. But again, the Chinese doesn't appear to want to have anything to do with it. The Europeans, for example, cite the treatment of Uyghurs, but at the same time, von der Leyen doesn't want to even call for ceasefire when the Israelis are, carpet bombing Gaza. So this doesn't really work. They're also trying to blame China for supporting Russia, even though, of course, the Europeans had a lot to do with provoking this war, and now also sending all these weapons. So China pretty much took the same position as the majority of the world population, which was, not supporting Russia's invasion, but also not supporting NATO's proxy war. Anyways, my point is, or questions, I guess, would be, how do you see this? How would Europe overcome this dilemma of not wanting to become too dependent on China? Because, for example, to look at the electric car market, that the Europeans simply can't compete with the Chinese. If the Chinese cars are coming here, electric cars especially, then there's no room for the European market, because on a high quality, low cost Chinese cars versus the lower quality, higher priced European ones, the Europe would deindustrialize simply because Europe's no longer competitive. But again, going against the Chinese is also not a great solution. So what would your advice be to the Europeans? Ideally, that would have become before this meeting.
Yeah, first, I don't think Europe or the United States can ever again talk about human rights the way they do. This claim Xinjiang is a genocide, which was absurd, completely fatuous to begin with, just a debating point or a talking point. And then when a real genocide's taking place, they don't do anything. It's right before our eyes. Mass slaughter, mass killings, mass ethnic cleansing, and they suck their thumbs. They don't do anything. So all of these arguments that have been used are phony geopolitical narrative arguments. They're games. They're not real. And some people may think they're making real arguments, but they should understand that the governments are making phony arguments. And I took this on with the US State Department when it talked about a genocide in Xinjiang without providing even one paragraph of backup, by the way. It was just games. So they should attend to the genocide that they're a party to, which is the one taking place in Gaza right now, and get this war stopped immediately. Now, when it comes to China, basically what's happening is that van der Leyen is just following U.S. instructions. I don't even think that this is a European view. This is the American view, falling behind your leader. And I blame Europe for constantly falling in behind the United States, because it's falling further and further behind by doing so. It's just absolute. Look at the trap that the U.S. got Europe into vis-a-vis Ukraine. Complete trap. Of course, the Europeans are not completely innocent of this. They watched the overthrow of Yanukovych. They went along with it. Why doesn't it? And the European leaders privately said things to me. Oh, yes, you're right, it's NATO. And then they say the opposite the next day. So I've heard the hypocrisy directly to me. I mean, to me, they tell me one thing, they say something publicly the next day. They're just following the U.S. Look, one day the United States decided Huawei is an enemy. Now, why? To my mind, because if it's a U.S. system, they can spy on me. But if it's a Chinese system, they can't spy on me so easily. So I trust Huawei equipment for my privacy more than I trust American equipment for sure, because I know what Ed Snowden explained to me, by the way, in a 8-hour face-to-face discussion once about what my own government's doing to me. So, but as soon as the U.S. said it, oh, the Europeans have to cut out Huawei everywhere. They just follow the U.S. lead. And van der Leyen's not the most clever person I've ever seen. It's not like there really are some original ideas there. And European foreign policy is shambolic right now. And Germany, sad to say, has really nobody has done more damage in peacetime to the German economy than the Greens, and Scholz letting them do it. And this is all very sad. So my advice to the Europeans: trade with China. Keep good relations with China. Improve your vehicles, of course. Don't be late. But Europe's pretty clever. Europeans like a good quality of life, and they have it. Europe has the highest quality of life on the planet, the shortest working hours, the highest living standards, the longest vacation time, the longest life expectancy. The Chinese work a lot longer hours, a lot harder, and so on. That's part of the trade-off. But I think Europe gets its high living standards by being clever, well-educated, technologically sophisticated, and yes, Europe should have a more strategic view. It fell behind. Look, Europe makes the leading advanced chips in the world, but it's all under U.S. control. Why doesn't Europe have its own control over ASML chip making capacity? No, the U.S. dictates everything. This is Europe's mistake right now. Europe's interest is not U.S. hegemony. Europe's interest is a peaceful, sustainable world and meeting China literally halfway on the Eurasian continent. If Europe had a good investment program, it would be investing fast rail out to somewhere in central Russia or out to Samarkand, and China would be investing in fast rail westward, and we would meet in the middle and celebrate the 21st century Silk Road, which after all is the whole idea of, and that would bring prosperity to everybody. China is not going to invade Europe. China is not a threat to Europe, period.
I completely agree. I mean, the idea that trade is a geopolitical threat, because that's what it amounts to, that trading with China is somehow conjuring up some kind of geopolitical threat. The trading with Russia was a geopolitical threat. It is so completely misconceived. It is so profoundly wrong. And you could see that what's happening is that some people, it just go back to what you were saying about the dollar at the start of the program. Some people want to use these trade instruments as geopolitical instruments themselves.
By the way, this is exactly Jake Sullivan's sophomoric idea. And it's sophomoric in the sense that you would expect to read it in a sophomore essay, but they're actually putting it into policy in the US that we need to weaponize trade. We need to weaponize the dollar. He wrote about this in the campaign in 2020. I thought it was a lousy article. I couldn't imagine it would become actual American policy. But the thing that I could never imagine is that the Europeans would stop thinking like they have and just follow along with the US. And this is really the big mistake.
Yeah. Professor Sachs, we've had you for, it's been an absolutely phenomenal program. We've talked about China and the Middle East and Europe. But I think because we've pivoted back to Eurasia, perhaps I'm going to suggest that we finish. Perhaps, Glenn, you've got something to say about Eurasia because this is your this is something that you've been studying and following very closely. You just met Professor Sachs talked about the Chinese and the Europeans building their railway lines and meeting. Well, why could we not do that? Isn't that exactly what was offered? And wouldn't it have been a great thing if it had happened? And wasn't that what Putin was advising and saying we should do? And isn't that essentially what Xi Jinping is telling us, the Europeans, to do? So over to you, Glenn.
No, I don't really have any much more to add, but I was thinking the same, that it seems a lot of our policies in this, greater Eurasian space from the Atlantic to the Pacific is very contradictory, because we're always very worried that, China's going to be this central power which everyone will be dependent on. But at the same time, we're sanctioning the Russians, so the Russians become more reliant on China. We're going after the Iranians, so the Iranians are going more to China. So it seems like the solution, are concerned that the world, all roads will go to China, could be solved by ending a lot of this sanctions war, because in this way, the Iranians have the same interest. They want to diversify their economic connectivity. They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket where they could be taken advantage of. They want to, connect with Europe. They want to connect with Russia. They want to connect with China. And this is, I think, a lot of what you see across this Eurasian space. It's about decentralizing and diversifying to prevent everything from being decided from one center, which allows it to be used as a political weapon, which allows economic connectivity, which should be a source of peace, to again become a economic weapon. So I think,
and maybe we could end with just one more terrible example of this that shows all that's wrong and all that could be right, and that is Italy just renounced participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is quite fascinating, because Italy, back in 2019, knew that trade with China is a good thing for Italy, because the Chinese love Italian brands, and the Italians have stylish brands, and the Chinese love it. And it brings a lot of income, a lot of wealth to Italy. And so Italy signed up, as it should, to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, just a couple of months ago, Prime Minister Meloni was called to Washington and was told by Biden, you've got to get out of this. And dutifully, Italy has told the Chinese, we are leaving the Belt and Road Initiative, and then we still want trade with China. We don't want to be misunderstood and so forth. But they left. Why did they leave? Not because even intrinsic fear of China, not because it was hurting the Italian economy, not because Italy lacked things to sell to China. No, they left for one simple reason. The United States told them to do so.
One of the main disagreements between the US and the Netanyahu administration right now is the reoccupation of Gaza. It seems that the Netanyahu administration is willing to keep control of this part, but the US foreign policy is not in agreement with this decision. How do you see this issue?
This is a very fundamental issue, because it goes to a deeper question, which is, what is the political resolution of all of this? It needs to be a Palestinian state, but that's exactly what the Netanyahu government opposes. So this is why we're in this crisis to begin with, that there has not been a Palestinian state established, despite more than 50 years of talking about it. And Netanyahu, who has been prime minister over most of the last 15 years in Israel, actively opposes a Palestinian state, actively opposes any limits on Israeli settlers in occupied Palestinian land, actively opposes Palestinian rights in East Jerusalem. So there's no political solution. We have, therefore, seething unrest, the terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7, now a brutal war filled with war crimes committed by Israel, but no political outcome because Netanyahu and his right-wing government don't want to acknowledge Palestinian political rights. And this is the crux of the matter. The United States is mumbling the right things, but typically in US politics, the US will back Israel because our politicians are trained to believe that if they show any real resistance to Israeli politics, they'll get punished domestically by Jewish voters or by Christian Zionists, and there are a lot of those. So this is the issue. There's a clear path to peace, in my view, which is a Palestinian state. Netanyahu opposes that. The U.S. is torn because it wants to support Israel, and yet at the same time, Israel's position is untenable. And that's what this argument is about.
It seems that the U.S. official policy in Israel is this two-state solution, as Antony Blinken said in his last meeting with Mahmoud Abbas. How is that possible? Because we have the West Bank and we have the Gaza Strip. How we can connect these two parts? There are many things in these discussions to be considered. Some people are suggesting one-state solution, something like Belgium, what we're seeing in Belgium. On the other part, you mentioned two-state solution, like in Cyprus, North Cyprus and South Cyprus. We have the presence of UN at the middle.
Of course, over decades, it's become harder to solve because Israel, quite cynically and knowingly, launched a settler campaign in the occupied territories beginning in the early 1970s. This wasn't spontaneous. This was part of Israel's security moves under something at the time called the Alon Plan. And the idea was to make settlements in strategic areas in the West Bank. And they've done that. And there are now hundreds of thousands, by one count, more than 400,000 settlers in Palestine, in the West Bank, and another 200,000 plus in East Jerusalem. So this makes things difficult. The taste for a one-state solution is essentially zero. I think it, in theory, could have a lot of merit, but it has no support in either side of this crisis. So I think combining that with the fact that there are 50 plus years of UN resolutions on the two-state solution, we should focus on implementing what has been promised and committed for decades but never achieved. And I believe it's time for the Security Council to meet tomorrow and vote a Palestinian state and membership in the United Nations, and to tell Israel that's the reality. It's not about your negotiations with the Palestinian Authority or anything else. This is a new world of a Palestinian state, and they're a UN member state, and you have to clear from occupied lands. Now, clearing, I think personally it would be fine for settlers to remain in their villages in Palestine. Those are details, in my view, significant ones, but the most important thing is to declare a Palestinian state and to disarm the militias as part of an overall peace settlement that establishes Palestinian political rights.
In Palestine, we have two authorities. We have the Gaza Strip, we have the West Bank. Is there any connection between them? Do they have any relations? How does it work?
Well, basically, neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority are really viable representatives of Palestine. Hamas has committed terrorist atrocities and ruled itself out from that. The Palestinian Authority is basically manipulated by the United States and Israel because it's funding is controlled essentially from the United States and Israel. So I think the fact is it's hard to have a responsible authority without a state. It's time to have a state first, construct a process to build a national government that would cover both Gaza and the West Bank. I think there needs to be also a physical connection between the two so that there's travel between the two areas. So there needs to be a transport corridor and other basic features of sovereignty that make this a viable state. But I think we just need to pick up the pace because you had the Oslo peace process, 10 years didn't lead anywhere. There are too many on both sides, but many in Israel that just don't want an outcome of two states, and they're able to block it nonstop. The rest of the world wants a two-state solution because, frankly, our global peace depends on it. This is awful to have these wars break out every few years. And so it's time really for the Security Council unanimously and the General Assembly, maybe by a vote of 192-1, if that's what it takes, with Israel being the only one not on side, to establish the basic parameters of peace.
How do you see the Netanyahu administration? It seems to me that they don't have any long-term policy for that region. At the end of the day, they have to learn how to live, how to coexist with these Arab nations. To make,
of course, but they've never believed that, and they've thought that the U.S. has their back. But if you look at history, the U.S. has had the back of a lot of countries that it didn't actually protect in the end. So Israel should be smarter than that. And it's a big mistake of policy, but their politicians are not visionaries. They're very rarely statesmen. Netanyahu is fighting for his political life hour by hour right now, day by day. They have no long-term answer to these questions. They believe for the moment that U.S. support is safe, but even in the U.S., we see huge differences between young people and older people. Older people tend to be much more pro-Israel, younger people much more pro-Palestine. So the Israelis should understand this is absolutely an unsustainable course. Morally, politically, geopolitically, militarily, everything. They need to do something else.
Right now, we have some sort of agreement between Sunni and Shia all together against Israel. How the geopolitical of that region is changing, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's a very important question because one of Israel's claims is we just have implacable foes and there's no one to talk to. And this is false. First, there absolutely were Palestinian counterparts to talk to. And the Israelis, in my view, never wanted to talk straightforwardly with them. They always wanted a deal, which was not really an adequate deal. Then came the question of the Arab states. And the Arab states were viewed by Israel as implacable enemies, but the Arab states said, back in 2002, more than 20 years ago, look, make a two-state solution. We normalize relations with you. We work for the security of both Israel and a Palestinian state. The conflict is over. That was the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. Did Israel grab at it? No, because there were forces in Israel that said, we don't want to compromise. We want the greater Israel, territorially. This is religious zealotry or cynicism or misguided ideas about security. It's actually a mix of all of those. But in any event, no, they did not rise to the occasion. Then their argument was, okay, maybe the Arabs, but Iran is an implacable foe. This also is not true. Actually, Iran has tried for a number of years to negotiate. The most important negotiation, of course, was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, negotiated between Iran and Europe and the United States over ending sanctions and Iran ending its nuclear program, bringing it under control. Signed, sealed, and then reneged on by the United States, which says, we're not going to do it. That's diplomacy. Then they say, oh, you can't negotiate with Iran. Well, Iran negotiated. Then it said, well, Iran is a renegade state, but Iran has just made peaceful relations and reconciliation with Saudi Arabia. That's a big deal, because if the Saudis want peace, Iran is going to go along with this, because Iran is becoming part of the neighborhood in an absolutely diplomatic way. Iran is joining the BRICS countries. So that means, is Iran going to say, we continue our war with Israel, even as Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Ethiopia, all the BRICS say, no, you don't? Are they really going to do that? No, they're not going to do that. So we have the makings of a diplomatic settlement. I think the big responsibility is for Netanyahu to step down today, because he's a failure and did not protect Israel and is a very divisive figure and opposed a political settlement, and for an Israeli government to reach out to the Arab neighbors and say, okay, we want peace. We accept a two-state solution. We need the UN to take responsibility. We need peacekeepers. We need demobilization of Hamas and disarmament of the militias and many other things, but all of that's within reach. Of course, Netanyahu's not going to be the one to say it, but he shouldn't be prime minister.
You talk about Netanyahu. As long as I remember, he was in charge, he was in power in Israel. Is there any alternative for his administration in Israel?
I'm much older than you, so I easily remember many, many, many prime ministers other than Netanyahu. He's finished. It's time for him to go. There will be so many new politicians. Politicians come and go. There are not indispensable politicians. And what there is the structural realities. And Israel's structural reality is that it needs to accept the Palestinian state, and it needs to make peace with its neighbors. And I'm sure that there are going to be politicians that will fill the bill, because politics is like a job search. You put up a terms of reference, and you get 100 applicants, and you choose one of them. So the terms of reference are make peace, stop this bloody war, and we'll find a lot of applicants for that position.
Turkey has a very crucial, important role for Israel. How do you see their relations right now?
Of course, Israel and Turkey have had good relations, and Erdogan had good relations with Israel, but Erdogan is saying right now, you're committing war crimes. You need to stop this. And Turkey is making a referral to the International Criminal Court of the Israeli leaders, because they're committing war crimes. So Erdogan is standing up for the Palestinian position. He's right to do so, in my view. He's not anti-Israel, but he is absolutely against this war, and he's calling it straight. Now, there was an important meeting in Riyadh a few days ago that is called the Arab Islamic Summit, that was both the Arab leaders, Saudis, Egyptians, Jordanians, Syria, with Bashar al-Assad going, also Turkey, very important, also Iran. So this is very interesting. The region is finding a new language of cooperation. It needs to. The climate crisis, the energy crisis, the economic crisis is all very severe. And the leaders of the OIC, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, are meeting together and cooperating together. And I'm excited by the fact that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Iran, Ethiopia, actually, but the four Muslim countries are all joining the BRICS. Good. This is a lot of regional cooperation that I think is quite important. And I think Erdogan plays a constructive role in that and aims to play a constructive role.
How much is the influence of the U.S. foreign policy on the Netanyahu administration, on Israel? How do you see this? Can they force them to do something? Can they pressure them to do something, in your opinion?
Yes, I would say the U.S. influence is decisive because if the U.S. Does not have Israel's back militarily, Israel has to have a political approach. Israel needs artillery shells. It needs the backing of the U.S. fleet. It needs military support, financial support. If the United States says, no, you have to stop, believe me, Israel will stop. It won't take long. What is Israel going to do? It depends on the United States. But the idea has been all along that Israel has the upper hand because of U.S. domestic politics. But I think that this is changing.
Do you see any possibility of a larger war in that region? Because we remember we had in Syria, during Obama administration, we had some sort of false flag attacks, operations. And do you see anything like that to happen in that region?
I would say for two reasons, the answer is yes. One is that sparks are flying, missiles are flying. American soldiers are being attacked and wounded. Israel is bombing southern Lebanon. Hezbollah's firing missiles. There's every reason that this can spread. But I would say a second reason is my guess is that Netanyahu would like it to spread because if it doesn't spread, the pressure is going to come on Israel to end what they're doing. And what Netanyahu wants to do, I think, is to ensnare the United States into direct fighting. That would be horrible. It would be devastating for Biden's politics. So I think the U.S. will stay away, except if one of these missiles kills a lot of U.S. soldiers, it becomes very hard in the U.S. also to resist retaliation and escalation. So we need to end this before something gets out of hand. Wars like this can really get out of hand fast.
Some politicians in the U.S., Lindsey Graham, is suggesting attacking Iran, bombing Iran. I talked with Colonel Larry Wilkerson. He said that it's impossible. We studied if we can win in a war with Iran, in a conventional war like Russia is doing in Ukraine. It's impossible to win this war without going nuclear. How do you see this issue? Is that a viable choice? Why they're suggesting that?
Well, I would say two things. One, I'm very interested to hear what Wilkerson says because he knows more about this than I do. And second, I can tell you Lindsey Graham's an idiot. So I'm sorry to say it. You know, we have senators that are idiots, and Lindsey Graham is a fool. And he's been a fool all along, and he's very dangerous. And there isn't a war that he doesn't love. And he has pushed the Ukraine war to complete disaster for Ukraine. And now he wants war in the Middle East. He's a fool. That's it.
If this conflict goes to Hezbollah, then Syria, then Iran, it would bring in Russia and finally possibly China in this conflict.
Look, all wars can spread when sparks are flying or bullets are flying or missiles are flying. You can always detonate the next weapons depot deliberately or inadvertently. You can always trigger another escalation. I don't think you can look at this and consider these people geniuses that are involved in this. They operate by limited information, gut, their domestic politics, their moods. And so this is very, very dangerous. Never let wars go on that can be stopped by negotiation because things can get out of hand. You know, it was a few bullets that started World War I. And we should not underestimate the risks of this. Same with Ukraine, even till today. These wars need to stop. They need to stop through negotiation. now. And it has been U.S. mistakes of not understanding negotiation. In Ukraine, the U.S. has rejected all negotiations up until now. In the Middle East, I think they sense they need to do something different because the whole world is aligned against this war, other than Israel. And so I think the U.S. U.S. leadership is feeling the tensions much more than in Ukraine, and that's why we're hearing even semi-reasonable things coming from the White House. They're not acting on them yet because, again, politicians in the U.S. are afraid to stand up to Israel, typically because of their perceived risk of political backlash at home. But they're going to learn standing with Israel in an intolerable war that has no political solution offered by the Israelis doesn't work for U.S. security. It's just way too dangerous. So I think events are going to move forward, but they could get out of hand before they reach a settlement. So I'm urging a settlement as absolutely as fast as possible.